week's episode of the Mixtape, I had the pleasure of meeting with Dr. Ariel Pakes. Dr. Ariel Pakes is the Thomas Professor of Economics at Harvard. He's one of the co-authors on a famous paper in Empirical Industrial Organization, known affectionately by others as just BLP, the initials of the three authors on the paper. Dr. Pakes and I discussed everything from his childhood moving into the present. We talked about growing up as a young man and being part of a socialist youth group, studying in Israel, falling in love with both philosophy and economics, as well as jazz and basketball, moving into Harvard, where he studied economics. And though he studied with John Rawls in his first year, he gradually had to let go of philosophy because he had to make some hard choices about what his career was going to be. I think you'll find it interesting to see how what maybe seemed like at the time, you might say a person that was distracted or maybe had too many things or couldn't focus. And in reality, it was just part of his production function. His tendency to have many interests and to tackle projects that seemed almost impossible was ultimately in the end part of what made him make really meaningful and important contributions to areas like IO and econometrics. He's made many such topics his focus, like patents, technology, and methods. But in the interview, it was his humility and his reflections on his life and his career, and both also the career of economists. I really enjoyed. I hope you like it too. I hope that hearing his story, you feel a little encouraged enough to continue to realize that your story matters, that you're on your own journey. It doesn't have to be his, but his wasn't like anyone else's either. And at one point, he was just also a young person or a young faculty member, just sort of trying to strike out on his own. To quote Jack from Lost, we either live together or we die alone. And I think if nothing else, listening to each other's stories is a way of trying to live together, or at least getting to know each other a little bit better, as each person matters. And each person also makes up the collective fabric of the profession itself, including you, the listener. So thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to like, share, and even possibly subscribe to the podcast. My name is Scott Cunningham. I'm your host of the Mixtape with Scott. This is my pleasure to have on the podcast today a very well-known economist, Dr. Ariel Pakes. Thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thank you.
Well, before we get started, for the sake of the listeners, I already said your name, but if you could say it again, please introduce yourself with your name, your job title, and the firm who is paying your paycheck every week or every month.
My name is Ariel Pakes. I'm a Thomas Professor of Economics at Harvard University.
Okay. Okay, well, before we get started, if I wanted to sort of do an icebreaker, when you think about a vacation that you've had in your life, either from being a kid or later, that's kind of like burned a memory into your head, what is one of them that you really sort of always still think about from time to time?
The Galapagos Islands.
Oh, wow. When did you do that?
I did it, I don't know, maybe it was 15 years ago with my kids.
Oh,
and
my
wife.
What was it like?
It was just a great trip. There was a group of us. Everybody was sort of into nature and athletics. Nobody was, and we went around from island to island by boat.
Oh,
Mostly slept on the islands. Looked at nature. You know, there's a lot of fauna and fish of various forms and birds of various forms. It's really quite amazing.
How many weeks were you there for? A week or more than that?
I think we were there for about 12 days, actually.
Oh, what a great idea. Was that your idea or was that one of somebody else?
My son was living in Ecuador at the time. And so, yeah, we do stuff like that. We've been to Patagonia, we've been to Thailand, we've been to different places, but Galapagos was very special.
Your family is very outdoors.
When we get together, yeah, that's what we do.
Yeah, you love the outdoors.
Yeah, I mean, we don't get together that often. You shouldn't get me wrong, but like, we have an apartment also in New York. I like jazz. Yeah, I like the NBA. There's other things we like in the winter, but going to beautiful places or interesting places is a lot of fun.
Oh, that's cool. Oh, that's a great. I'm gonna be thinking about the Galapagos Islands. There's not many economics conferences at the Galapagos Islands, so I've not yet gone. So I'm gonna have to probably go out of my way to go there.
Yeah.
Um, okay, well, let's get started. So tell me about growing up. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Edmonton, Alberta.
Oh,
My parents were originally immigrants from in the 1930s, Jewish
oh,
immigrants. America's doors were closed. They came to Canada.
oh,
Um, I don't know what else to say. My dad was, was one of these people who worked all the time and just wanted his kids to get an education.
yeah,
We got an education. I could tell stories, but that's essentially it. I mean,
yeah.
um,
What'd your mom do?
she actually, she was a very intelligent woman who at a very young age was forced to go to work because of the Great Depression and stuff like that.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah.
so when she came over, she skipped 4 or 5 years of school and did very well, but then had to work. I think she was always sorry she never went back to university. But she
Yeah,
didn't. So
yeah. And what did your dad do?
he, when he came over, actually, he started trading furs in the Northwest Territories. And then him and his brother founded a bedding company for upholstery and beds, which was
Oh,
reasonably successful. I mean, so
oh, wow. What was Alberta like as a kid for you?
cold.
Uh-huh.
um, it's Edmonton, right? It's probably the coldest city in the Northern Hemisphere. It's a real city.
Uh-huh.
Um, I, you know, I, you know, I, my father was ill much of the time that I remember, and then went to high school in Edmonton, and I joined a socialist. I did two things. I joined a socialist youth movement.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, and I played basketball. I played almost all sports, so my time was divided between those two things.
Yeah.
I didn't know anybody else who did the same couple of things.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah. So
You're the first. I thought it was a null set of socialist, kids playing basketball in high school. Now I know it's not.
uh, that's
What
true.
drew you to socialism? How did that happen?
Um, it was sort of the most interesting. So it was a socialist Zionist group.
Uh-huh.
It was times when I don't know. My mom, not my dad, but my mom was very involved in sort of Zionism. The socialism part of it was just interesting philosophically
Yeah.
for me. So when I did my BA in Jerusalem,
Yeah.
and I had a double major. One was philosophy and one was economics. So I took two
Oh,
majors.
did you
So
you got the philosophy major?
yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So it always interested me starting from social philosophy, but then I actually got interested in philosophy of science for a while
Huh.
uh, when I was in Jerusalem. Um, so
So you and your mom had these kinds of, is this right? Am I right that you and your mom would have these kinds of conversations about uh
not
sort of,
really,
oh,
not
really?
really. Yeah, just the youth movement. We, it was pretty intense.
I don't know
So,
much about this youth movement. What was that?
we had a summer camp. I went to twice for 2 months each. I was outdoor, you lived in tents and you discussed stuff lots.
Yeah.
You learned a little bit about the outdoors, but for the most part, you discussed various things. So,
How
we read stuff.
were there a
Like,
lot of famous Jewish socialist philosophers at that time that was it particularly like a connection of Zionism and socialism, or was it nothing? They're not really connected.
no, I think historically, if you look at the beginnings of the labor movement in the United States, it's mostly Jewish immigrants or a lot, not mostly, but there were a lot of Jewish immigrants that were part of that. It
Hmm.
was the Europe there was something called the Bund in Europe, which was Jewish socialism.
Oh,
There was a lot of that came over at that time.
yeah,
But my parents weren't particularly socialist. It was just me. I mean,
yeah.
so my mom was Zionist, but not
Ah,
socialist.
yeah. So what about that? So what drew you to Hebrew University?
I think, that's a good question. There's a few people like me that did things like this, which is, I was bored. I was not happy in Edmonton, Alberta. I think I was just, I don't know, bored might be the wrong word, but I just wasn't happy. And just before, in April or May or something like that, towards the end of the school year, yeah, there was a scholarship that opened up at the Hebrew University, and my mom said, if you want, you can apply. I applied and I got it.
Oh,
I was only supposed to go for a year, but
really?
I stayed. Yeah, but it was like a foreign student program,
Oh,
and I stayed for 5 years. So
what happened
uh,
that first year that made you want to stay?
it was just, um, it's interesting for a kid who grew up, pretty reasonably privileged and reasonably protected in, North American society. And then you go over to a country where at that time, it was a much poorer country at that time. And
Mhm.
there were people from all over the world. It was really an interesting place in those days. I
Yeah.
mean, there were all sorts of people coming through from, even the kids from the States that I met. Um, one was going to end up being a reporter for the New York Times. One ended up being the producer of Sesame Street. We had friends that were just all over the place. And
Wow.
it was really fun. Later, Israel became more religiously connected, and that
Oh,
turned
it
me
was
off a bit.
not then. This was the 60s,
No,
right? This was the late 60s.
yeah, I went to Israel just after the Six-Day War, which was in
Oh,
'67. So I went in '68.
huh. Did Israel and Hebrew have the same kind of cultural revolution kind of thing that you associate with American universities? Like, was that temperament or the music scene or anything like that kind of a
No,
thing there?
no, not really. So I actually missed out on a part of American society culture
Yeah,
those 5 years. So I've learned, over time I sort of picked up some of it, but I missed most of it.
yeah.
Now, Israel was in a whole different spot. Um, um, in a way, in retrospect, an unfortunate spot, but because they had just won the Six-Day War, it was uh, there was a lot of ego running around, and I think they did
Mm,
the wrong things. But
mm.
it for me, I learned. I had friends who were French. We're friends from Morocco. I actually lived in the Arab section of Jerusalem for 2 years.
Oh,
Uh,
was that
so it was
common?
just no, it wasn't. In those days, it wasn't. In the very first days that I came, there wasn't so much antagonism
Ah,
because, um, you know, the Arabs didn't want the Jews there, but they did. They cleaned up the water and the old city and stuff. Kids never got dysentery anymore. So there was fairly good. There wasn't great feelings, but they're fairly. I mean, for people like me, there was good feelings because I would come and speak English to their kids and play football with their kids and stuff. But
yeah.
but
Wait, football, American gridiron football or soccer?
well, we tried to show them they were much better at soccer than me. So I tried to show them American football.
Yeah.
But I mean, it
Were you,
was, yeah.
go ahead. Sorry.
No, it was fun. And I look back on it fondly those years. So uh there's a ton of stories I could tell you.
Were you still following basketball? Were you
No, I stopped following basketball till I got back to America. Now I follow it again.
you
I
followed
mean,
it?
there was about a 5 or 6 year period. Actually, after I spent 5 years there, I spent a year traveling. But when I finally got back to America, I started following basketball, and I'm a I'm an addict. I waste too much time on basketball.
Yeah. Is it the
Yeah.
same team now? You said New York, so I'm assuming it's the Knicks or something.
It was the Knicks, and now it's the Celtics. Now that I'm back in Boston, so
Oh, right.
uh,
Okay. Yeah. What was it when you were a kid? Who were you following when you were a kid?
uh, I wasn't really following the NBA when I was a kid. I was just playing. That was
Who
my
were you
favorite
playing?
sport. I followed football. I played all sorts of crazy sports. At least
Yeah.
I wasted a lot of time. Other than that, yeah.
Yeah.
So
Well, so at Hebrew in the 60s, I interviewed Shoshana Grossbard and she went to Hebrew. And I want to say that I can't remember if she said which university professors from America were there. I want to say she kept saying some Chicago people, but it was a very heavy, it was a very good place for economics. Was that like what it
yeah,
was for you?
yeah. It was at the time I was there. It was really super. There were a lot of superstars there.
Who all was
Well,
there?
the older guy who sort of set up the place was a guy named Dan Patinkin, who wrote a monetary policy, a very important book on monetary policy. Um, there was a guy named Michael Bruno who taught me development and planning, and he was he was the governor of the Bank of Israel for a while after that, and then he was also the head of the World Bank, vice president of the World Bank. He had, I think over the years, he probably had offers from many of the major universities in the States. There's a guy named Yoram Ben Porat,
Yeah.
who was a labor economist, famous labor economist, I think he did the first model of education.
Yeah.
There's a guy named Menachem Yaari, who was a theorist, who was a famous guy. It was really stacked.
So how did you end up in econ at Hebrew? You're because you do this master's in econ, so I'm assuming that you sorted kind of sooner, relatively quickly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah. I think my professors in philosophy also wanted me to do a doctorate in philosophy. My attitude towards philosophy was it was really interesting, but many of the questions that I wanted answered hadn't been answered since time immemorial, and I wasn't going to answer them. And so an economics seemed just more real world to me.
Yeah.
So I did that. I tried other things. I took a year off after my MA, tried to be an author, decided I wasn't good at that. Did a bunch of little things. I was on a university I was an editor or an associate editor of the university magazine. That was fun, but I knew I wasn't going to, eventually I worked out I wasn't going to be a journalist.
Right.
So I stayed with economics.
Well,
Not,
go ahead.
Yeah. No, I wasn't sure when I got here to Harvard. That's why while I was away, I had to send applications to graduate schools and I got accepted to Harvard with scholarships and stuff.
Yeah.
And when I came here, I wasn't sure really what I was going to do, whether I was going to try and be a journalist or being an economist. Or I spent my first half a year studying with a guy named John Rawls in the philosophy department.
Oh, you did? Really?
Yeah. Because
the first year of the econ PhD program, you were studying with Rawls?
Yeah. But you shouldn't get me wrong. In the second half of the year, I had to catch up to everybody else. It wasn't easy.
Yeah. The dual graduate work at Harvard in Rawlsian philosophy and micro sequence seems kind of intense.
Yeah, it was pretty intense for a while.
Well, so you get this experience of econ, but it's like I guess it doesn't really fully grab you even at Hebrew because you sound like you're on the fence a little bit because you sort of travel around and stuff.
Yeah, I think what happened with me is when I finally decided that I was going to be full head economics, I wanted to do the economics of technological change, which ended up being the hardest topic in the world to do, as far as I could tell. So, I took steps back from that and tried to figure out what you would need to do in order to study it. Yeah. And that's how I got into industrial organizations.
When was that? Was that the first year or that was like a little bit later?
It was later. My thesis was really supposed to be in technological change, and it wasn't technological change, don't get me wrong. But there was no framework that I liked, that I thought was good. So I took a step back. I think a little bit my philosophy background sort of told me to take a step back and look for a framework, a model to analyze could use the data together with the model. I did spend quite a bit of time in my last few years studying econometrics.
Yeah.
When I came in, I didn't have any math degree. I never took any math courses formally.
Yeah.
I did read math books, but I never took math courses.
Oh, even at Hebrew, you did.
Yeah, I didn't.
They didn't push you on that.
No, because I did okay the way I did it. I studied by myself a little bit, and then I wrote a paper when I was a graduate student last year of my graduate school. I wrote a paper with a guy named Rick Erickson, who was an assistant professor here, just starting assistant professor, and I was finishing graduate school.
Mm-hmm.
And he convinced me that I should read this math textbook, Royden, and do every second problem. So I did that.
Every second problem?
Yeah, because it would have taken forever to not do everything. So I did that. And, that's when I sort of started becoming a little more technical.
Yeah.
He was a stochastic process guy. He was very good at math.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what was the puzzle? I guess there was some puzzle with technological change that you felt really dissatisfied with something. Yeah. What was the deal?
Well, I mean, you needed to know what was generating the incentives. So you needed a demand system. You needed a cost function or a production function. You needed to know how people made investment decisions. None of that was in the literature at the time. I mean, it was in the literature, you shouldn't get me wrong, but it wasn't in the empirical or applied literature.
Got it.
So the goal was to sort of put that together into a framework that could be usable.
You were saying that was it ambitious of your did they think it was pretty ambitious what you were going to try to do?
So in that context, I remember Janet Yellen was here. She was teaching us macro at the time, or maybe it was I think it was macro. And I remember telling her this, and she said, she asked me what I wanted to do. And I said, I wanted to mix empirical work with theory. And she said, that was the hardest thing to do. I remember her saying that. But I think, I wrote my thesis with, my advisor was a guy named S2E Grolkes, who you probably have heard of.
Yes.
And Gary Chamberlain was the econometrician on board. And Gary was a super solid, thoughtful guy. And S2E was really just a very good social scientist. So he let me do what I wanted to do, provided it was done in a serious way. So I don't think he wasn't particularly happy with the theory part of what I was doing.
Really?
Because he was more of an empirical guy. Yeah, but I think he bought in eventually.
Oh, so you've got like an applied guy and a pure econometrician guy.
Right.
And you're bringing all this micro theory to it, all this IO theory.
I'm trying to, yeah. That's the attempt.
Yeah. Was there nobody at Harvard at the time that would have been like a more logical fit, or was that like just where the literature was, that it was just like?
I think that's where the literature was. The only people really doing applied work, with serious sort of thought to econometrics were the labor group, maybe a little bit of public finance. But there was the IO stuff was mostly, it was the years of structure, conduct, performance. I don't know if you know though. Was still dominant. Was still dominant at that time.
Yeah, I forgot about that.
And people who just did correlations, and that was it.
So was that so when you write that dissertation, what did it feel like to the journey of it?
I remember I really enjoyed my last couple of years at Harvard. I didn't enjoy my first couple of years. It was too hard. I mean, I tried to do too many things. My father passed away my first year here. It was just a rough couple of years. But the last couple of years at Harvard, I really enjoyed. It was just a blast. I worked with different students mostly. I mean, I remember talking to somebody at Harvard who said, the one thing that Harvard's good at is if you have a good idea, they pay attention to you. And I think that's true. I think it's still true, by the way. So I didn't really connect with anybody before I started writing stuff. And then people wanted, if you had a good idea or something serious, people here will talk to you. I mean, there's no question.
Uh-huh.
They're busy people, but they'll pay attention to a good
So that
idea.
was Dr. Chamberlain and Dr. Grillich.
Yeah, and others also. I remember Mike Spence was here, and
Oh,
so there was, and he was a theory guy. So he actually, I remember him saying after I gave my thesis talk that he never understood a word, but maybe we should talk. Um, it was sort of like that. It was fine. It was really fun. Also, the students I was working with were good. So,
just out of curiosity, did you ever meet David Lewis, the philosopher?
no, I don't think I did. I haven't.
Oh, okay. He I think was all in those circles with you over studying Schelling. He would go to the Schelling seminars. Apparently, I think he's got some signaling piece in one of his books, and it's filled with Schelling sites. I was just curious. Okay, so
Schelling, by the way, was a very creative guy. I mean, if you think of the time he was writing, he
yeah,
was just he was alone. I
uh-huh.
mean, so I didn't really know about him until later.
Oh, okay,
I
yeah.
mean, yeah.
So you
So
weren't like sorting into all these like game theorists that were like beginning to emerge. You were kind of like IO econometrics, but you could like you clearly had this like ability to kind of interact with this theory too, but you weren't going over there to those
I
guys.
didn't do that. The game theory that happened at the time, there
Yeah.
was, yeah, I should take a step back. There were two things that went on in game theory at the time. One was just frameworks of conceptual ideas for equilibrium notions.
Wow.
Okay, so it's based on some form of Nash equilibrium, usually Markov perfect or Nash, Markov perfect Nash, pricing Nash, something Nash, or
Yeah.
Nash bargaining.
Yeah.
Um, so there was that, and that did impact me. I mean, when I wrote with Rick Erickson, we were doing that.
Mhm.
Um, the theorists were doing it in a way of just showing that there was this notion of equilibrium that made sense. So for them, an equilibrium was just everybody's doing the best they can, so nobody has an incentive to deviate. That's it. I mean,
Yeah.
and you could say that in 15 different ways with 15 different conditions on it and stuff like
Right.
that.
Right.
But then the applied theorists took over, and much of it was sort of demonstrating what could happen in a game theoretic context. So when firms were interacting, what could happen? Okay, and it's sort of this is when I started getting involved a little bit. What could happen depended on functional forms, timing assumptions, whole bunch of different things.
Yeah.
And I thought our role as empiricists was to figure out the right assumptions for different industries, for different situations where we want to make policy. So
Mm.
that's sort of where we came in. When they, I think I got a little bit bored of reading one article after another, which got different answers for the same problem because of different assumptions.
Right.
Not that they were useful in the sense that they taught you sort of what could happen and what to look for in the data that would, structure a model in a way that would rationalize it.
Right.
But there was sort of no definitive thing on any industry.
Yeah.
Which got us going, which got me and my friends going, I guess. Me and my students and friends going.
Huh.
So if you look what happened afterwards to the empirical side of it,
Yeah.
it's mostly industry studies by single industries,
Oh.
and policy for those single industries.
Oh.
So that's still what I do, I mean, still today, though I got to admit I'm getting, yeah, I go back and forth between methodology and empirical work, but
Yeah.
the empirical work is, once in except for maybe one or two things I've done, the empirical work is all focused on particular industries.
Hmm.
It has methodology in it, but it's focused on particular industries.
Yeah. But your early work, I see a lot. about patents. Is that the same thing
Yeah,
as what you're describing? If it being like,
that's the end of my period of technological change.
oh,
Uh, um, but even that works. So I got the Frisch Award for patents as options in 1986, I think.
uh,
Um, and that medal, I think partly it was for doing an empirical study, but partly it was for I and two others in different fields did the first dynamic models of agents' behavior that were
mm,
estimated.
hmm,
So it was partly just methodology, and indeed in that paper, there was a lot of new things. For me, I was just trying to solve a problem, but in order to solve the problem, I needed these new things. So there was, I think, maybe the first simulation estimator in actual estimation.
uh,
Dan McFadden had been using it to figure out whether rapid transit would work in Berkeley,
right.
but not in an actual estimation algorithm. It was
Oh,
maybe the first paper, certainly the first paper who solved a dynamic program and then and then integrated out over people so you could only get aggregates, because I only saw the fraction dropping out in every period and stuff like that. So there was a lot of methodology in it, which is, I think, part of the reason I won the Frisch Award.
huh.
It was my first big paper.
Did you have a sense that it was going to be a Mount Everest kind of climb, big paper that
Yeah,
you were going to have to like do a bunch of creative stuff?
um, yeah, as I went on, I figured out that I needed to do a bunch of stuff. I mean, I didn't. It was the same with almost everything I've done, which is I start on a problem because I think it's an important problem, and then I run into problems, and I often end up asking friends how to figure it out. Like
Uh-huh.
somebody who's better than me at econometrics. In this case, by the way, um, the year that I was writing patent as options, I had come back here to visit Harvard. Svi Grolkes had invited me back for half a year.
Uh-huh.
I didn't have to do anything except for research. But Dan McFadden and Chuck Mansky and the MIT crowd were holding this seminar, which was any problem you have that we don't know how to answer, you can come and give a paper. So I gave a paper. I got a lot of ideas. I mean, it was very helpful. I mean, they didn't solve it, but Dan, I think it was either Dan or Chuck mentioned, you should try looking at simulation estimators and stuff like that. So there was a lot going on here at that time.
Huh.
Uh,
You said
and
McFadden was doing that, but he was not doing it. Did I hear
I
you
mean,
right?
as far as he's Dan's one of my heroes. Okay, so you shouldn't get me wrong. The BART project, if you
Yeah.
look back at the report on the BART project, I don't think it might not have ever been published. I have a copy somewhere.
Ah,
The way they evaluated what would happen is they did simulations of, people, and then they post facto, they looked to see if they were right or not. And they did very well.
mm,
So that's the one thing about simulations that I knew about before I started my paper.
yeah.
Now,
Okay.
there may be more out there that I just don't know about. You shouldn't get me wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
So he suggests this to you.
either he or Chuck, I remember them both being there. Jerry Hausman was also there making suggestions. There was a lot of them sitting around. These were the greats of those days.
Yeah.
And Gary was probably there too, Chamberlain. I can't remember that, but I do remember the three of those guys. And it lasted, instead of lasting an hour, I think it lasted 2.5 hours. Everybody just stuck around trying to figure out the answers.
So what's the puzzle that you present to them? What is it that you were like nothing else works right now? And so what was it exactly?
So there was a computational puzzle of how to solve a dynamic program and then for different people and then integrate out and get estimators of the parameters that were heterogeneous across the population.
Oh, right, 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 right,
So,
right.
I mean, that sounds technical, but it was,
Well, why were
yeah.
you even asking that in the first place? Why were you asking it and like it hadn't been asked before?
So I wrote a paper as a graduate student with a guy named Mark Shankerman, who's now at the London School of Economics, on the rate of obsolescence of knowledge. So people, had been constructing knowledge stocks with with the normal depreciation rates of capital, which are usually 2 or 3% for structures and 5 to 10% for equipment, depending on the equipment.
Yeah.
And we thought that we found some old data in a paper by Nordhaus, and about patents dropping out, not paying the renewal fees.
Oh.
They start, and so that's what patents as options. My paper was all about.
Okay.
What can you tell from people not paying their renewal fees? What was the value of the patent?
Oh.
So so Mark and I looked at this and wrote this little paper that said, you guys got it all wrong. This is not about the depreciation of physical things. It's about the depreciation of knowledge, how knowledge gets obsoleted. And that rate is much different from the rate of capital depreciation.
Can you give me an example of what that means? Like give me an example with a patent of that kind of thing happening.
You have I don't know, let's take pharmaceutical. You have a pharmaceutical that does X and another, and it's very productive. It doesn't really ever decay physically.
Right.
You can, okay. But another pharmaceutical comes along, which has less side effects. And is cheaper.
Right.
And then it goes away. But not because of physical decay, just because of the next time something comes along that obsoletes it.
Oh, that's really interesting. Because it's an idea. It can't really disappear.
Right.
Yeah. Is that a social? How does that enter into the welfare function? You losing do you lose it?
No, I mean, it's knowledge which builds on knowledge.
Right.
Okay. So there's externalities involved, always, because the second guy who does the second thing knew about the first thing.
Right.
So all of the knowledge producing stuff has externalities involved with it, which is the problem with it. So patents themselves are an institutionally created property right.
Yeah.
There's no real, they're created to give people incentive to discover things.
Mm-hmm.
And again, give them, that if they didn't have patents, they wouldn't get any return from it, or get a very small return from it.
Mm-hmm.
Because somebody else could copy the thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's it. I guess I gotta put my power cord on, or my computer's gonna die.
Okay, I'm gonna pause it real quick. Okay. Well, it's funny the way you're describing it. You could think about that crowding out of knowledge or bumping it off, and you don't really necessarily have to bring in markets. And even though you said it's a property right that provides incentives for people to engage in research and development, but I could imagine under different market regimes, that it doesn't necessarily always have, that it isn't maybe always unambiguously positive. And I'm just curious now, how do I need to think about that process of like knocking something out?
So there's two parts of this. So the stuff that is, the national research labs and the universities that are funded, in the hospitals, also some of the research in hospitals, are funded largely through the government, because there is very little incentive for a private company to do the basic research that they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Even if they did discover something, there are two aspects of it. One, if they did discover something, somebody could copy it. But the other thing is, we don't want them to keep it proprietary, the basic research. We want everybody to know about it. So that's the reason for things like the National Institute of Health, all the national research labs. The thing that's true is, at least in health, which I've looked at, the US is doing much more than any other country per capita, and also per GDP. It's striking, the difference. So there's that stuff that's funded by government. And then there's private firms and you can't expect the private firm to do something without a return. I mean, it's a fiduciary responsibility of the manager to do that.
Right.
So, and those are all markets. It's so, the one I've been thinking about lately is pharmaceuticals. But so those are all markets with firms competing against each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so you need the IO is determining the incentives and how they interact with each other. The industrial organization of that. That's a very that's sort of at the limit of what we can do right now in industrial organization.
Oh, that's fascinating. So I do want to keep talking about that, but then I won't get to other things. So yeah,
Okay, go.
Funny as I hear you say that, I wouldn't have anticipated you pivoting into automobiles and specific prices or specific markets like that. But is there a logical kind of path from what you were working on? I mean, because you do mention McFadden, and then there's so much of this paper I want to talk about. I can see the connection, but was that a bit of a smooth transition, or was it sort of different?
So I think what happened with the auto stuff was Jim Levinson showed up at Yale one day and gave this seminar. I remember his wife was giving birth, so he had to go back right away. So we went out for pizza, and he gave this. He was working on a paper with Feenstra on autos. Jim knows a ton about autos, or at least at the time, he was really very well versed. And Steve, Berry, and I and Jim went out for pizza quickly, so we get Jim. And I think I sketched, or maybe Steve and I sketched out on a napkin how you would do BLP, how you would do this right. And I remember telling Jim, if you come back in the summer, we'll do it. And Jim always reminded me that it took 3 years to do
it was 3
We did
summers.
do it, but it took 3 years to do it.
Yeah. Wait, so that's funny. So he presents this paper, which somehow is incomplete. What is he talking about?
No, he was talking about the relationship. I'm trying to remember now, between characteristics and prices, and competitors' characteristics and prices. It appeared, I think, in the Review of Economic Studies. I don't remember exactly the details. But the thing about autos, that sort of, first of all, Jim was fun, and he had the data and he knew stuff. But the other, again, when I work on a applied project, I try to work with somebody who knows the industry. So he did. But the other thing was something that Zvi Griliki's always taught me is you should work on something that people care about. And the auto industry at the time was probably the biggest manufacturing industry in the United States.
Oh, yeah.
It is not anymore.
Right.
So people cared about I remember, there's this famous quote that as GM goes, so goes the American economy, or some crazy thing like that. But when we said we knew how to do demand for autos, people paid attention.
Oh. So did you care about automobiles, or was it just like
you learn to care?
Yeah,
you learn to care. You study, you read books about it, you talk to people in the industry. Similarly, I did telecommunication equipment once with a paper with Steve Ollie, which took a long time. And it's my most cited paper, but I learned a lot about telecommunication.
Yeah.
And now I'm learning a lot about pharmaceuticals. So you try and work with somebody who knows knows the industry. So again, if you go back to what we're trying to do, we're trying to figure out how to analyze an industry. There's tons of models around, but we want to pick the aspects for the model that mimic the industry, so that we can do counterfactuals and things like that.
Yeah. So what was dissatisfying at that exact moment where it's another one of these big problems that like you're not satisfied with the framework? What was the situation like that at the time?
There were two sort of things that were wrong. I mean, I don't know exactly what I thought of at the time. Let me just be careful. Okay, I know what I think about it, which is there were two problems. One was, and I think, by the way, both Steve and Jim were aware of this too. It's not just me. Most products, most markets for differentiated products like autos or almost anything else, there's 50 or to 100 products being marketed. So if you did a standard demand system with quantity on one side and prices on the other side, you'd have 100 prices for each product, and you have 100 products. That's 10,000 parameters, even if it's just linear.
Right.
That's impossible.
Yeah.
For anybody. I mean, there's no data set that can do that with any precision.
Right.
So when we filtered it down into characteristic space, all I needed was a distribution of preferences over the important characteristics.
Oh.
So, and then I could get you all 10,000 cross price elasticities.
Yeah.
Or not, I could get you. When I say it's probably wrong. It's unfair. All the characteristics. So you needed to know how to put in an just like in a demand system, you have X's and then an unobservable. We needed to put in an unobservable to take care of the characteristics that we were not including.
Yeah.
And so we needed to learn how to do that. So,
did you present any of this early on to Dr. McFadden?
Dan, no, I don't think. Dan moved to Berkeley.
Yeah.
At some point.
Yeah.
I mean, I saw him in a couple of summers and we talked. When I did, so eventually, by the way, I went back to I had a Yale offer when I was just on the market. I never went on the market as a junior guy because I had this Hebrew University offer and a Yale offer before I ever went on the market.
Oh.
I never took the Yale offer. I went to Hebrew University and then came back. And when I came back, it was just too hard for us in Israel. We weren't making a lot of money. My wife was from Bogota, not from Israel. We had no family there to help us once we had a kid and stuff. So I came back, and when I came back, Yale said, well, why don't you come here for a half year? You don't have to do anything. Just sit in the growth center and talk to the people who are doing development.
Yeah.
And I took this course from this guy, and I wanted to figure out how much math I knew because I had been reading this math, but I never took a course.
Right.
So I went to a course by a guy named David Pollard in the stat department. Actually, he had a joint appointment in math and statistics on measure theory. So I learned a little bit about measure theory. And then about 3/4 of the way the course, I went up to David and I said, I have this problem that none of my friends know how to solve. And because I had asked a bunch of people, and it was how to do simulation estimators. So David said to me, I'll explain it to you and you explain it to economists. And then I was in Cambridge giving another seminar, and I bumped into Dan, who was in Cambridge at the time. And he said he'd just written the same paper. It was the same idea, only he did it for multinomial probits. And I was doing it, David and I were doing it more generally, but it didn't, it was exactly the same problem.
Oh.
So Dan organized this afternoon with 4 papers on this. So David and I came in, and then we had dinner at Dan's house after. Dan was great like that. He was always like that. But you can see what goes on. Something happens, you realize you can all of a sudden do things that nobody could do.
Yeah.
That might be important, and everybody gets excited and starts working together. It's just a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So we worked really hard on the simulation stuff. For me to keep up with David was because I didn't have the math background. David taught me things point why, he would go to the backboard and show me exactly why it works. And then I'd go home and study it. He'd show me something else. It was great. It was a lot of fun.
I once heard this journalist interview Dizzy Gillespie, but you've maybe heard this story, or maybe you'll appreciate it. And he said, well, why did you set out to invent bebop? And he said, well, I didn't set out to invent anything. I just was making music.
That's sort of the way I felt. I got to admit, by the way, I'm a big jazz fan. So Dizzy Gillespie strikes a thing in my heart. Not as much as Dave Brubeck, but a lot. So
that's how it's been. You've not really been trying to do anything except for what? Except for just, what's the equivalent of you of just making music?
It's just finding a problem that I think is important to understanding economics. Usually it's a methodological problem in a setting that has like right now I'm working on dynamics, the advertising for pharmaceuticals, and whether that's good or bad, or what happens if we stop it. You might not know this, but we're the only developed country that other than New Zealand, we're the only other developed country that allows advertising for direct to consumer advertising for pharmaceuticals. It's illegal in Europe.
Why? What's the problem? There's, I
The
guess,
argument.
Yeah.
There's two parts of it, really. One part of it is, they have incentives to sell you something you might not need. And the other part of it is, of that part, I can give you the other argument also. But the other part of it is, it's largely business stealing. That there are 14 drugs that do the same thing. And by allowing, this is just a waste of energy. They have to go to their doctor anyway to get it. The doctor will know these things. We allow advertising direct to doctors, just not direct to consumers. So why should we allow direct to consumer advertising?
What do you think?
There's the other.
What's the other argument? I'll ask you what.
Yeah, the other side of the argument. I'm trying to figure out what I think right now, but the other side of the argument is, by the drug companies, is largely. I'll give you a particular example, which is drugs for heartburn, like Zantac, Pepcid, Axid, those drugs. So I think what the drug companies would say is, maybe, who gets heartburn? Who gets heartburn are people who eat very rich foods. Okay, they're usually poor people who don't go to see doctors. Okay, and if they don't, they will see it on TV. If you tell them on TV you have heartburn and you can go see a doctor, they might go, but they'll never, if they just have heartburn, it's a normal course of events in certain societies, and they'll just and heartburn can turn into very serious diseases if it's not treated properly.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So sometimes it can turn into ulcers and things like that. Ulcers is a good example, by the way, because it's something that in my parents' generation, you probably don't remember this, but lots of people got ulcers, and it's very serious. I don't think anybody gets ulcers. I haven't heard anybody getting ulcers anymore.
I haven't either. Yeah, it seems more like a person says they got an ulcer, but they don't actually. I've never heard somebody actually diagnosed with one. It's usually just kind of almost like a self-diagnosis thing that I've never heard actually turn into one.
Yeah. So they now can fix it. I mean, when earlier on, they now have drugs that fix it and stuff like that. And if you knew about it, you could go to your doctor and get it.
So when you study this stuff, everything you're kind of bringing up is like really specific. It's like heartburn or automobiles or things like that. I mean, is that how it typically is working? That you're like, you are specifically very interested in, I mean, is it, you're like specifically interested in a very specific drug or whatever? Or is it like, you're kind of more, because you said methodology. So how is it fitting together?
So, it's usually the little stories to get you interested.
Yeah.
Okay. But like the advertising for pharmaceuticals, I got interested. I was always interested in pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceuticals is a huge industry and it's very important, and there's tons of regulation around it that you might want to, mitigate or change slightly. But it also brings up the question of dynamics, because if I advertise today, it causes demand today and demand tomorrow and so on. And if I advertise for my drug, I might take away from the other guy's drug. So there's all of that. That's the part of industrial organization that's least developed now. And I think I know why, and I've written a couple of theory papers on why. So actually with a guy named Chaim Frischman from Tel Aviv, we've written papers called experience-based equilibrium papers. And I thought this was a good example to try the new stuff on. I cared about it, and I could and I wanted to learn how to transfer the theory into empirical work, into an empirical methodology.
Yeah.
And I think we're almost there. So
so even within like health and medicine, you're finding, is it true, like each of these particular compounds are sufficiently different from a market perspective that you have enough to kind of like do all this novel thing? I would have
So
always
what?
thought like you do one and then that's it.
No, we do. We're actually we're following industries markets over time. Okay, we're
Mhm.
actually following four of the highest. I'm working with a guy from Toulouse in France named Pierre
Mm.
Dubois.
Mhm.
Um, we're following investment demand and advertising expenditures um, in four drug markets:
Mm.
anti-ulcer, anti-rheumatism, anti-ulcer, anti-asthma, and anti-cholesterol.
Mm.
So, and each one has different parameters. We estimate different parameters. It's a similar model, but the demand systems are different and the reactions to the advertising are different in the different markets. And
Can I
so,
see that like this is like the grandson of BLP? Can
in a
you
way,
see the signatures on it?
BLP is the demand system we use.
Yeah.
And then what the advertising does is it increases the quality of the product in the demand system.
Oh, that wasn't there. Yeah, yeah. So that's the more newer part, or
Yeah, and
that's
then
the unique part, or one of them.
we never did any investment. So
Oh, oh,
that's really the newer part. But
oh.
it does use the BLP demand system, and then it uses everything. It uses the experience-based equilibrium framework.
Yeah.
It's a framework where a lot of the problem with doing dynamics, this is probably more than you want to know, so you
No,
should stop me. A lot of the problem with doing dynamics is that if you write down the basic models that theory gave us,
yeah.
they're just too complicated. They're too complicated for firms to solve, and they're too complicated to compute on the computer too.
Mm-hmm.
So this experience-based equilibria is a way of getting around that we're
Mm,
developing to make it easier to use, and also to probably, hopefully, reflect more of what firms actually do, seeing they can't do the perfect thing.
yeah. Yeah. I was curious. I want to stay on this topic, but I didn't get to ask this, so I just got to return to it real quick. How surprised were you that BLP was has become so influential? Was there like a part in your career where you thought, "Huh, this one seems to be catching on like wildfire," or is it not? I mean, I don't really know how it progressed, but was there a part where you thought this really has been very impactful?
So uh, BLP is not my most cited paper.
I saw that. Yeah, it's another one.
It's the one on how to estimate production functions,
Right. Right.
which was the other. So there was cost and demand, and
Yeah, yeah.
but you know, let me put it differently. BLP probably took off faster than any of my other papers,
Mm,
but I think all the papers that I thought were really solid ended up taking off. So I
mm,
thought that the Ariel Pakes paper, I thought the patents as options paper was really good.
mm.
Really good for me. They were my best papers. The paper with Rick Erickson were my best papers. It was clear. They took me years to write, and my heart and soul was in them.
Yeah.
And so, but BLP took off faster than anything else. And the reason was pretty simple, which is they needed it for merger review and things like that. So the
Oh,
consultants picked it up right away.
oh. Did that surprise you, or did you guys kind of know
Yeah,
that
no, that
probably
surprised me. Now I know more about consulting, but then I think it surprised. It's not a surprise. I just didn't think about it. That's
right?
not what we were thinking of doing. We
Yeah.
weren't trying to present them with a tool.
Well,
We were trying to figure out how.
did you notice at some point you're like, oh, there's some consultants here from McKinsey or whatever. I mean, it's like, did you kind of notice like
You can't help but notice they come to you.
they come to you? Oh yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, right. They like take you out for pizza and stuff.
yeah. I mean, if they're going to use it in a court case and they have Steve Berry or Ariel Pakes or Jim Levinson for that matter on the case,
Yeah.
it looks like they're serious about it.
Right. Wow. 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 That's really inspiring. I don't think that's really neat. Just to see that your passion and heart has always kind of pushed you through all of this. I mean, you you've led with your heart, it seems like. Is that right? You're
I led with my instincts. Let me put it that way.
oh, okay. Yeah.
Uh, that's what, by the way, that's what, my thesis advisor, C. Grillakes, was really good at that. He
Uh-huh.
understood when something was a real problem.
Mm,
Uh, so I picked up from different people. You can see I picked up from different people as I went along.
yeah. Yeah.
So
Well, so if you could go back in time and talk to yourself, as your younger self, and like tell them kind of like now you've seen a lot. What do you think you would tell your younger self, maybe like either college, graduate school, or even like whenever? What do you think that you would tell them that maybe would be useful for them to know?
I so just apropos on this, I remember talking to my wife and saying, maybe I should have taken math courses. This would have been a lot easier if I would have taken it formally.
Yeah.
And she said to me, if you hadn't have taken the philosophy courses, you wouldn't have looked at the same problems in the same way.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably true, by the way. Although, if you ask me for a linear model of how the philosophy course, maybe the philosophy of science course affected me somewhat, but
Mm,
I don't think, I can think of personal mistakes I made in relationships and things like that
yeah.
that I would never do again. And I think I remember one of my friends is Al Roth. I don't know if you know who he is.
Yeah. Yeah. I love them.
So I remember Al and I sitting down and saying, I just never expected to be this successful.
Mm,
He had exactly the same response.
uh-huh.
So maybe if I would have had more self-confidence, I would have done things slightly different.
Yeah.
But it's because of my lack of self-confidence, I was so careful and detailed about everything I did.
Yeah.
So I don't know how I would change it. You
You don't
should
want
get,
to tell your young self anything. It sounds like it's one of these like
no,
back to the future things. You're gonna
be
mess
nicer
everything up.
to certain people, to be nicer to certain people. I would have
Yeah,
totally.
right, right. No, tell me about it. So let me ask you this then. When you talk to these young PhD students, and you sort of see, you wish you could tell them things. I mean, is there generic advice that you sort of like to give to young people, or is there something that you think is like the returns to experience that you sort of wish you could just distribute more broadly to young people?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, so different students, I've had a lot of students. Different students sort of are going to do different kinds of things. So, I've had students, I could use names, but who are really good at what they do in a particular field. I've had students who are just very methodologically thoughtful. I've had students who are technically really superior. And each one has, you sort of treat them differently because they're interested in different things and they're good at different things. I think the one thing that I tell students, especially here at Harvard, is you have to do something that you believe is right and do it to the best of your ability.
Yeah.
So there's around here anyway, people tend to write 3 or 4 papers. And I tell every student who comes in, on the market, people aren't going to look at one paper. They don't have time. There's 50 guys on the market. They're not going to read 50 papers. They're certainly not going to read 3 of your papers.
Right. They're
Okay.
not going to read 150 papers.
Yeah, they're not going to even read 20 papers, I promise. And your job, is to do something really well that people will pay attention to.
Right. Right.
So I think that's my major message. And it can be very empirical, it can be very methodological. As long as you do it right. So, the, at least my good students, they have to be able to explain everything that they're doing to me. I have to understand how they got from A to B to C to D, and I don't know, it's been useful. And that's, by the way I learn about things, mostly through my students.
Through your students.
Yeah.
Through your students. Part of the production function that is that they're teaching you stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot.
A lot. Yeah. It's very cool.
It's also, by the way, let me just say, many of my good friends are ex-students now. So they're a big part of my social life, never mind my intellectual life.
That's awesome. That's great. Well, it's top of the hour. I really, really have enjoyed this conversation and apologize for some of the technical difficulties, but I really appreciate you giving me some of your afternoon to talk about your life and your career.
Okay. Thanks very much. It was
okay.
fun.
All right.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.